Well, I absolutely am wholeheartedly in concurrence with everything Vanessa has been saying, especially when it comes to traditional versus non-traditional sources. I keep saying it time and time again, you have to be thinking outside of the box. You have to really be taking some time to really just get creative, see what works, really think about what aligns with your mission versus those shiny moments in the corner, right?
Yeah, and Ashley, to add, Ashi, to what you just said, one of the things that in the business world, corporations tend to push out to their employees is that you have to be a disruptor in the industry. And what we have found is that those individuals who have stepped outside of the traditional sources of funding and began looking at other ways to fund their organizations, those individuals have been ones that have been disruptors to even how funding gets done in nonprofits. And some of those changes that we see, or some of the things that are driving the changes, are because of those disruptors, those industry disruptors. And Matt, you were going to say something?
Oh, just that as startup people, it's important to remember that, because as that new ideas come from sources typically outside any discipline. It's the people who are, young and starting, or the ones who had experience in another discipline who now bring it into whatever they're doing now. And so as a startup organization, you really have an opportunity to take your past experience and apply it in ways that folks who have been in the industry, you might say, had never thought of, just because you come from a different perspective. And so take advantage of that if it's at all possible.
You're absolutely right, and that's great information for any nonprofit. When you talk about the sources of funding, the more traditional sources of funding, what we found is that nonprofit organizations, some of the ways that they've been funded in the past is through contracting or subcontracting with organizations that have grants, getting grants for themselves, individual donors, major gifts, direct mail and ask, special events, annual meetings, and then selling goods and services. Some of the things that nonprofit organizations can begin to consider tend to be more traditional and more non-traditional sources are some of the approaches such as crowdfunding. A lot of organizations have begun doing crowdfunding, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Also pursuing corporate sponsorships. A lot of corporations have the ability to give a certain amount of money without even asking any permission. The person who you're asking for those resources, banks, for example, can give up to $5,000 without having a vice president sign off on those resources. In our local community here, I'm actually in Cincinnati region. And then as well, going after donations, direct donations from donors, and membership fees, which is something that a lot of organizations a lot of smaller organizations tend to miss the opportunity for having a membership structure where individuals can give to your cause. Arts organizations, for example, some of the larger organizations will have a membership structure where you can raise funds that way by having people join as members of your organization. As well, developing partnerships is going to be very important in this funding environment for nonprofits. And also pursuing funding through various foundations and government agencies. Those are some other non-traditional kinds of funding that some larger organizations or more innovative organizations are now pursuing.
Well, back you go. I'm sorry. I totally lost the audio
so
at some point here.
Okay, so you heard me kind of talking about what those sources of funding are, traditional sources of funding, and then some of the non-traditional sources of funding, which are on the screen. Did you hear that part, Matt?
That once you got past corporate sponsorships, I heard this click, and then it all went away.
Okay. So to pick up from where I left off on corporate sponsorships, I talked a little bit about donations and membership fees, and that a lot of arts organizations will have a membership structure, which they then go after some of the more the organizations the individuals that are more aligned with their cause. Arts aficionados, for example, might join an arts organization as a member of that organization, which can provide some much needed funding in that direction. And also developing partnerships is going to be very important for organizations in this particular funding environment. And then, of course, foundations and government agencies. Oftentimes, people will go after grants and grant funders, but they'll ignore the fact that there are private foundations out there that also give money. And government agencies, working with government agencies to solve particular problems as well, is an approach that a lot of nonprofit organizations have available to them. But oftentimes these government agencies don't get very many applications for those kinds of funding opportunities. And so the grants.gov will list the government agency funding at the federal government level, but also local government. State and city governments also have funding opportunities that nonprofit organizations can pursue.
And while we're talking about websites, you might consider going to Candid, which is the Foundation Center website, because there will be probably a Foundation Center outlet, a terminal at either a local library or some other organization available to you as a nonprofit to search through who might be a good funding source. And then the other thing to consider is for corporate dollars, a few things there. First of all, there's a big difference between sometimes their corporate philanthropic budget and then a marketing budget. Their marketing budget will have smaller dollars, but maybe more locally accessible, like you said, that $5,000 limit and for some banks in Cincinnati. And remember that small business, you're really still looking at an individual for the most part, because it's not a small privately owned business doesn't work like a big corporation.
Exactly. And so another thing I think that people miss when they're looking at how to go about funding their organizations, they see these big numbers that are given by corporations and these big grant numbers. But what people miss is that 70% of all charitable contributions are actually made by individuals. And, across the world, other nations boast similar numbers, that most of the giving is coming from individuals. And so what that means is that of the billions of dollars available to nonprofits every year, it's individuals and not foundations that are making those giving, that are making those donations. And so grant-making foundations often change their priorities, and most have fairly arbitrary rules that are subject to change at any time. And so that destabilizes a lot of giving. And so I want to just give an example. I want to use an example from, our president, Donald Trump, who has been able to mobilize quite a following, actually, when it comes to getting people involved and identifying philanthropists for his cause. And for many of us, we might have heard that Donald Trump, some of the folks surrounding Donald Trump, some congressmen, as well as others, began to look at individuals to fund Donald Trump's prize wall. And so what we found is that he became a master in the ability to identify philanthropists and identify givers as philanthropists and not just donors. Philanthropists are individuals who will invest in that vision. And he built a movement and not a moment. He identified investors and not charities, and then found partners and friends and in order to build his pipeline. And so that's something, this is a page out of his funding his wall that a lot of nonprofits can take, and looking for partners and friends to build that pipeline. So philanthropy is so focused on impact that it leaves little to no money for capacity building. Or for things like leadership training, organizational development, or other support systems for organizations. And so small organizations can merit large grants, but foundations are concerned that giving large grants to small organizations could actually cripple a small organization. And so those charities and foundations are very careful with who they give to and how they give, and ensuring that a high percentage of the revenue that these smaller organizations get does not come from one source. Because what foundations understand about the tax implications of that is that it could change the nonprofit, their legal status, from being a public nonprofit to actually a private nonprofit. So what foundations will look to do is to not give anything more than 26% of an organization's revenue. And that then protects that small organization. And small organizations aren't thinking about this when they go after some of those big dollars, but foundations absolutely are concerned with that. And that's one of the things that they look at when they ask you for your budget. They're looking at how much of your budget are you asking for through their foundation. And so when smaller or newer nonprofits are asking for resources, you want to keep in mind that this is something that's very important to some of these traditional funding sources.
Vanessa, one of the things you said was about the nonprofits' ability to attract people who aren't, let me start that over. One of the things you said was the difference between philanthropists and donors. And yes, like you said, our president has really seen how that connection goes, but it really speaks to the fact that people who are interested in what you're doing, if they have a concern about the mission that you're engaged in, are much more likely to be donors than people who aren't. It just makes sense, right? So if you don't treat somebody like an ATM, you are more likely to get business, to get donations from them than if you do.
Exactly. And what I'm going to show later on in my presentation, I'm going to talk about that donor funder and where a donor starts out and then what we're actually looking to get to. And so that slide's going to come up here in a minute. And I'm going to talk about converting some of those individuals from just a mere supporter to a lifelong giver.